Her name was Elara Vance, and at 19 years old, her beauty was a curse. In the dusty, desperate frontier town of Canyon Pass, a woman's worth was measured by her hands and her hips. But Elara had been silent for 10 years, rendered mute by a trauma that had stolen her voice, and her father, Marcus Vance, had long since decided she was broken currency. He stood on the warped porch of the Devil's Luck saloon, his eyes cold and satisfied. "She's beautiful, Finn, I'll give her that," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for the jeering crowd to hear. "But she's a mute, useless as a milk cow that won't feed. She's just another mouth. Your money is worth more than her silence." The man opposite him, Malachi Finn, was the saloon's proprietor. He had a face like spoiled leather and eyes that held no light. He ran his gaze over Elara, who stood frozen by the wagon, his look a physical violation. "I don't need her to talk, Marcus," Finn rasped, tossing a heavy leather pouch onto a barrel. "I just need her to look pretty for the customers upstairs. She'll learn what's expected." "They always do." A hand clamped onto Elara's arm, and the crowd laughed. She was a ghost in her own life, a beautiful doll being sold to the highest bidder, her silent screams trapped behind her teeth. But as Malachi Finn began to drag her toward the saloon's swinging doors, a voice cut through the afternoon heat. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of the mountains. "How much?" The crowd turned. Standing in the shadows of the livery, a tall, broad-shouldered man leaned against a support beam. He was a stranger to most, a solitary rancher from the high country known only as Jed Stone. He wore no gun, but his presence was a weapon in itself. Malachi Finn sneered. "This ain't your business, cowboy. Move along." Jed Stone pushed himself off the beam, walking into the sunlight. His face was weathered by wind and grief, his eyes the color of a winter sky. "I asked," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "How much?" "Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Dave, your narrator of Frontier Rescue Stories. Before we find out what happens in that dusty street, I have a small favor to ask. If you believe that even in the harshest wilderness, a single act of kindness can change a destiny, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs a little hope. Make sure you subscribe to Frontier Rescue Stories so you never miss one of our adventures. And please drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from today. A big hug to you all. Now, let's get back to the story. The tension in the street was so thick, the dust didn't dare to move. Elara Vance stood trapped between two men, one who saw her as merchandise, the other. She didn't know what he saw. Malachi Finn, holding her arm in a bruising grip, sized up the cowboy. Jed Stone looked like a man who had nothing, yet he stood like he owned the ground beneath his boots. "She cost me $50. Finn lied, his voice slick with greed. "That's my price if you're so eager to buy damaged goods." Jed Stone didn't blink. He reached into the saddlebag on his horse, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and tossed it onto the barrel next to Marcus Vance's. The thud was heavy, final. "There's 60 in there," Jed said. "That should cover her and the trouble of you changing your mind." "Now let her go." Finn's eyes widened, first at the money, then in disbelief. He looked at Elara, at her terrified, beautiful face, then back at the cowboy. He couldn't understand the play, but money was money. He shoved Elara forward, causing her to stumble, and snatched the pouch. "She's all yours, rancher," Finn spat. "Hope you enjoy the silence." Marcus Vance, Elara's father, stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "Now hold on, that was my deal." Jed Stone turned his cold gaze on him. "Your deal was done. You got your money from him. This is my deal. You," he said to Marcus, "are done." He then looked at Elara. She was trembling, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. She was looking at the ground, waiting for the next order, the next owner. The cowboy didn't move toward her. He didn't grab her arm or tell her to follow. He just stood there waiting. The crowd, sensing the show was over, began to drift away, disappointed. Finally, when the street was almost empty, Jed spoke to her. His voice was not harsh, not angry, but quiet. "Ma'am, my name is Jedediah Stone. I run the High Star Ranch up in the Bitter Creek territory. It's a 2-day ride from here. It's quiet, it's safe, and it's where I'm headed." Elara looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. He wasn't dragging her to the saloon. "I've got a small bunkhouse," Jed continued, as if talking to a spooked foal. "It's separate from the main house. It's clean. It's got a lock on the inside. You can stay there. You can work for board, cooking or mending. Or you don't have to. You can just be safe. And if after a week you want to go somewhere else, to Denver or back east, I'll give you the money to get there. This, he said, nodding toward the saloon, this ain't no life for anyone. He was offering her a choice. It was a language she no longer understood. Her father had beaten her for looking him in the eye. Malachi Finn had bought her for her body. And this man, this stranger, was offering her autonomy. He turned and walked to his horse, a big roan that stood patiently. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just mounted up. Then he held out a hand, not to her, but to a sturdy-looking mare tied to the rail. This one's mine too. You can ride her, or you can stay. It's your choice. Elara looked at the swinging doors of the Devil's Luck Saloon, a place that represented a living death. She heard Malachi Finn's grating laugh from inside. She looked at the dusty street that led back to her father's shack, a place of cold hatred and starvation. Then she looked at the cowboy, Jed Stone, a man whose eyes held a profound sadness, a man who had just paid $60 for a woman he had no intention of owning. She took a single, shuddering breath. It was the first breath of her own life. She walked past Jed's horse, and with a trembling hand, she reached for the reins of the mare. She couldn't speak. She couldn't say thank you. She couldn't ask where they were going. But as she pulled herself into the saddle, her silence was an answer. Jed Stone watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he just nodded once, turned his roan, and rode west, out of Canyon Pass, heading for the high, lonely peaks of the Bitter Creek territory. Elara Vance, the mute girl who had been sold for the price of a saloon girl, followed him, riding toward a future she could not possibly imagine. The journey to the High Star Ranch was a long, aching silence. Elara rode behind Jed, her body sore from the unfamiliar rhythm of the saddle, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. They moved out of the low, dusty basin of Canyon Pass and climbed into the high country. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and snowmelt. They followed a narrow game trail, winding up through jagged rock formations that looked like the bones of the earth, until the world she had known was just a brown smudge in the distance. Jed Stone never pushed the pace. He seemed to know she was unused to riding. He stopped every few hours by a running creek, letting the horses drink and offering her water from his canteen. He didn't try to talk to her. He didn't ask questions. He just existed. He moved with a quiet competence, checking the trails, watching the sky, his presence as solid and reassuring as the mountains themselves. For Elara, the silence was a strange comfort. Her whole life, silence had been a weapon used against her, or a void she was expected to fill. But Jed's silence was different. It was respectful. It asked nothing of her. He didn't seem to notice her muteness, or if he did, he didn't care. He treated her not as a broken thing, but as a person. They made a cold camp the first night. Jed built a small, smokeless fire, roasted some bacon, and handed her the first share, along with a piece of hardtack. He then laid out his own bedroll near the fire and motioned to the spare roll he'd packed. "You take the spot by the rocks," he said. "It's sheltered from the wind. I'll take the watch." Elara slept in fits, waking at every snap of a twig, every call of a night bird. But Jed was always awake, sitting against a boulder, his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness. He wasn't watching her. He was watching over her. It was a feeling so new, so profound, it terrified her. They arrived at the High Star Ranch late the next afternoon. Elara didn't know what she'd expected, perhaps a rough, tumble-down shack, but what she saw made her breath catch. Tucked into a high meadow, protected by a ring of towering aspen trees, was a solid, beautiful log home. It was well built, with a deep porch and real glass windows. A sturdy barn stood nearby, along with a network of solid corrals. A creek ran through the meadow, its water clear and fast. This was not the home of a desperate hermit. This was the home of a man who was building something to last. Jed dismounted and walked over to her mare. "Welcome to High Star," he said quietly. He helped her down, his hands gentle on her waist, releasing her the moment her feet touched the ground. "The main house is mine," he said, pointing. I lost my family a few years back. My wife, Sarah, and my boy, Daniel, died of the fever. It's just me now." The confession hung in the air, explaining the sadness in his eyes. He had known loss. He understood what it meant to be broken. "This," he said, walking her toward a smaller, separate cabin near the main house, "is the bunkhouse. It's where my ranch hands used to stay before. He pushed the door open. It was a single room, but it was immaculate. It had a sturdy bed with clean blankets, a small cast-iron stove, a table, and a washstand. "This is yours," Jed said. "Like I promised. There's a bolt on the inside. No one will bother you. Not me, not anyone." Elara stepped inside. She ran her hand over the smooth wood of the table. A room of her own. A door she could lock. She turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't know how to thank him. Jed seemed to understand. He just nodded, his throat working. "There's food in the main house pantry. You're welcome to it. When you feel up to it, we can talk about chores. For now, just rest." He left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in her new home. A life of quiet, shared work began. Elara was a hard worker, and she was desperate to prove she was not the useless burden her father had claimed. She rose before Jed, starting the coffee in the main house kitchen, feeding the chickens and milking the lone dairy cow. She was a meticulous cook, and by the end of the first week, Jed found himself looking forward to meals for the first time in years. He never forced her to be near him. They worked apart, but in harmony. He would mend fences or work the horses. She would tend the large garden his wife had once planted, her gentle hands bringing it back to life. She washed their clothes, mended his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and kept the main house as clean as her own. They rarely spoke, but they found a rhythm. He would leave a brace of rabbits on her porch. She would leave a fresh-baked pie on his table. It was a silent conversation, a barter of respect. Jed found himself watching her. He watched her move through the garden, her beautiful face serene. He watched her gentle hands with the animals. He realized with a jolt that his ranch, which had been a fortress of his grief, was starting to feel like a home again. He hadn't just rescued her. She was, in her own quiet way, rescuing him. Autumn deepened in the high country, painting the aspens a brilliant, burning gold. The air grew sharp, and the threat of winter became a daily presence. Jed worked relentlessly, stocking firewood, securing the barn, and bringing the cattle down from the high pastures. Elara worked beside him, her hands raw but her spirit determined, helping him smoke meat, preserve vegetables from the garden, and seal the cracks in the cabin walls with fresh mud and straw. They were a team, moving in the quiet, efficient rhythm they had established. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding. The first blizzard hit in late November. It didn't arrive gently. It descended on the High Star Ranch like a white wolf, a howling, shrieking tempest of ice and wind that buried the world in drifts 5 feet deep. For 3 days they were trapped, the world reduced to the 4 walls of the main cabin. Jed had insisted Elara move from the bunkhouse, bringing her meager belongings into the main house for warmth and safety. He gave her his own bedroom, taking a bedroll for himself by the hearth. The storm was a terrifying, violent force, but inside a strange peace settled. They sat by the fire, Jed carving a new axe handle, Elara mending a thick wool blanket. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. On the 3rd day the wind died, leaving an eerie, muffled silence. Jed stood at the window, staring at the impossible drifts. "The roof of the north barn," he said, his voice tight. "It won't hold this weight. And the cattle are in there." Elara watched him pull on his heaviest coat and wrap his face. He grabbed a shovel and his rifle. "Don't go," she thought, the silent words screaming in her mind. But she knew he had to. He was gone for hours. Elara paced the cabin, watching the sky darken for the evening, her anxiety a cold knot in her stomach. When he finally staggered back through the door, he was covered in snow, and his left arm was hanging at a sickening, unnatural angle. He collapsed onto the floor, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Jed!" The name was a silent gasp. She rushed to his side. It's the shoulder!" He gritted out, his teeth clenched in agony. The roof gave. A beam. It caught me. Elara's panic lasted only a second. Then, the years of abuse, the years of having to be competent, took over. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a survivor. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she helped him to the chair, her hands gentle but firm. She cut away his heavy shirt, revealing the bruised, swollen, and clearly dislocated shoulder. Jed looked at her, his vision blurring with pain. "It's bad, Elara. You can't..." She put a finger to her lips, not his, but her own. A gesture that said, "Be quiet. I know what to do." She moved with a focused, desperate energy. She stoked the fire until it roared. She fetched the small wooden box of herbs and remedies she'd found in his wife's pantry, adding to it the wild herbs she had gathered herself. She recognized willow bark for the pain, yarrow to stop the bleeding from a cut on his arm, and comfrey root. She boiled water, steeped a potent bitter tea from the willow bark, and held the cup to his lips, forcing him to drink. Then she looked at the shoulder. She knew what had to be done. It was a choice that terrified her, but leaving it was not an option. She took a deep breath. She braced his back against the heavy log wall. She gripped his arm, looked him straight in the eyes, and gave a single, powerful, agonizing pull. Jed roared, a sound of pure agony that echoed the storm outside, and then he slumped forward, his body finally free from the tension. The shoulder was back in its socket, but the ordeal had just begun. The pain, the cold, and the exhaustion sent a fever through him. For the next 2 days, Jed was lost, drifting in a delirium, calling out for his dead wife, Sarah, Sarah. The fever's too high, and his son. Daniel, hold on, son, just hold on. Elara did not sleep. She sat by his side, bathing his face, forcing water and willow tea down his throat. She rubbed a salve of comfrey and pine resin, her own remedy, onto his bruised shoulder. She listened to him call for another woman, and she felt not jealousy, but a profound aching sorrow for the depth of his loss. She was nursing this man who was grieving a ghost, and she was doing it in a cabin that should have been that ghost's home. On the third morning, she was exhausted, dozing in the chair by his bed, her hand still resting on his forehead. She woke when his hand, warm and steady, covered hers. She looked up. His eyes were clear. The fever was gone. Jed? She whispered, the sound of her own voice in her head. He just looked at her, his gaze taking in her exhausted face, the dark circles under her eyes, the gentle, capable hand that had not left him. You stayed, he said, his voice rough. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. You saved my life, Elara. She couldn't speak, but she didn't need to. He reached up with his good hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. His thumb lingered on her cheek for just a second. It was a touch that said everything. It was a touch that spoke of gratitude, of wonder, and the first terrifying thaw of a heart that had been frozen for years. In the silence of the snowbound cabin, two broken souls had just saved each other. Spring arrived late in the Bitter Creek territory, as if the mountains were reluctant to let go of their winter grief. But when it came with a wild, vibrant rush. The creek swelled, the meadows exploded with Indian paintbrush and columbine, and the air was alive with the sound of birds. Elara, however, was focused on something else. Jed owned a horse, a beautiful black gelding named Shadow. The horse had belonged to his son, Daniel. Since the boy and his mother had died, Shadow had become like Jed himself, haunted, solitary, and violent. He was a broken thing. He let no one near him, least of all Jed, whose presence seemed to remind him of his loss. He's grieving, Jed had told her, standing by the corral fence. I should have sold him, but I can't. He's the last piece of my boy I've got left. But he's dangerous. Stay away from him. Elara, however, understood grief. She understood what it was to be broken by a memory. She began to visit the corral, not with a rope or a bridle, but with handfuls of sweet clover she'd picked from the creek bed. At first, Shadow would rear and snort, his eyes white with fear and anger, kicking the fence. Elara would just sit, speaking to him in a low, soft hum, the only voice she had. She'd leave the clover on the ground and walk away. She did this every day for a month. Jed watched from a distance, amazed. He had tried to break the horse's grief with force and had failed. Elara was healing it with patience. One afternoon, Jed came out of the barn and froze. Elara was inside the corral. Shadow was standing stock still, his head lowered, and her hand was on his neck, stroking his mane. The horse that hadn't let a human touch him in 3 years was leaning into her, his eyes half closed in trust. Jed walked slowly to the fence, his heart hammering. How? He whispered, afraid to break the spell. Elara looked up, a small, sad smile on her face. She motioned to the horse, then to her own heart. He's broken, she signed, a simple gesture she had taught herself. Like me. What broke you, Elara? Jed asked, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Your father? She shook her head. She led the horse to the fence, her hand never leaving him. She looked at Jed, her eyes dark with a memory she had locked away for a decade. It was the first time she had ever tried to tell anyone. She pointed to her father, Marcus, in her mind. Then she made the motion of a striking hand, swift and brutal. She pointed to a woman, her mother. Then she pointed to a horse and made the motion of falling, of being trampled. Her hands covered her face, her shoulders shaking. Jed's blood ran cold. He finally understood. He killed her? He breathed. Your father. He killed your mother? Elara nodded, tears streaming down her face. She pointed to herself, a small girl watching from the shadows. Then she pointed to her throat and shook her head. She had screamed, and when the screaming was over, her voice was gone, stolen by the horror of what she had seen. 10 years, Jed said, his voice thick. You've carried this for 10 years. He stepped through the rails and put his arms around her. He held her as she wept silently into his chest, her grief and his own mingling in the quiet afternoon. Shadow, the broken horse, nudged her shoulder, as if standing vigil. Your father didn't just sell you, Jed said, his voice vibrating with a cold fury. He buried you alive. He held her tighter. But you're not buried anymore, Elara. I see you. You're not broken. You're the strongest person I've ever known. She looked up at him, her face stained with tears, and in that moment, the wall between them, the wall of his grief and her silence, crumbled to dust. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his charge. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow and the promise of a new spring. It was a kiss that said, we are both broken, and we are both whole. Their life at the High Star Ranch settled into a new kind of peace, one that was no longer silent, but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. The love that grew between them was as quiet and steady as the mountains, a thing built on shared work and mutual healing. Elara's muteness was no longer a barrier. It was a part of her story, and Jed had learned to read her expressions and her simple gestures as clearly as if she were shouting. The ranch thrived. The cattle were healthy, the garden produced a surplus, and the cabin Jed had built as a monument to his grief had become a beacon of their shared future. But the wilderness is not the only place that holds predators. One afternoon in late summer, Elara was in the garden, humming as she worked, when she heard the sound of unfamiliar horses. It wasn't Jed. He was mending fences on the south ridge. A cold dread, a feeling she hadn't felt in almost a year, washed over her. She stood slowly and saw 2 riders emerge from the aspen grove. Her heart stopped. It was her father, Marcus Vance, and with him, the saloon owner, Malachi Finn. Marcus had aged, his face puffier and his eyes meaner, but it was him. Malachi looked the same, his greasy clothes and leering smile making her skin crawl. Well, well, Marcus called out, his voice a cruel mockery of a greeting. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the healthy cattle, the solid barn, the beautiful cabin. His gaze was full of a bitter, resentful greed. Looks like our silent little girl found herself a king's ransom. Elara stood frozen, the gardening trowel falling from her hand. We heard in town, Malachi Finn said, his eyes devouring her. Heard the Cowboy Stone got himself a fine ranch. And I heard he got my property. She ain't your property. Jed's voice came from behind them. He was walking from the barn, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He had seen them from the ridge and circled back. His face was a mask of cold fury. She's my wife. Wife? Marcus scoffed, though he looked nervously at the rifle. There was no preacher, no paper. She's my daughter, my property. And this person, he spat, broke our contract. He bought her from Finn, but he owed me for her upkeep. I've come to collect Stone, or I'm taking her back. You're not taking anyone, Jed said, his voice dangerously low. Oh, I think we are, Malachi said, and he pulled his own pistol, leveling it at Jed. See? Marcus and I were partners now. He gets a cut of the ranch for finding it, and I get my merchandise. The merchandise you stole, Elara's mind was screaming. This was a nightmare. The 2 men who represented all the cruelty in her life were here, in her sanctuary, threatening the only man who had ever shown her kindness. Elara, Marcus said, his voice turning falsely sweet. Come here, girl. We're taking you back to civilization. You don't belong here with this hermit. She shook her head, a silent, desperate no. Don't make me come and get you, Marcus snarled. You take one more step toward her, Jed warned, raising his rifle, and it'll be your last. You can't shoot us both. Malachi laughed, his pistol steady. Drop the rifle, cowboy. Drop it, or I'll shoot her right where she stands. She's beautiful, but I can always find another. Jed's face went white. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with an agonizing choice. Slowly, he lowered the rifle and let it fall to the dirt. Good, Marcus sneered. He strode forward and grabbed Elara's arm, his fingers biting into her skin just as Malachi's had a year ago. You're coming with us. You're going to make me a rich man, one way or another. He began to drag her toward his horse. Elara clawed at his hand, but he was too strong. She looked back at Jed, her eyes a silent plea. Jed stood helpless, Malachi's gun trained on his chest. You should have stayed gone, Stone, Malachi said, his finger tightening on the trigger. This high, lonely place is a good spot to die. Marcus Vance laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed Elara's worst memories. He was dragging her toward his horse, his grip like an iron vise on her arm. You always were a stubborn, useless thing, he spat, his face close to hers. Did you really think this cowboy could save you? No one wants a broken doll. He raised his hand, the same hand that had held her down, the same hand that had struck her mother. Elara flinched, her entire body braced for the blow that had defined her childhood. No. The sound ripped through the high meadow, raw, powerful, and shocking. It wasn't Jed's voice. It was hers. The single word, her first in 10 years, was so loud it startled the horses. Marcus froze, his hand in midair, his face a mask of disbelief. Malachi Finn, his gun still on Jed, flinched and looked toward her. That second of hesitation was all Jed needed. He lunged forward, not at Malachi, but at Marcus, slamming his shoulder into the man and knocking him away from Elara. Jed put his own body between them, shielding her. Elara, run, he shouted, turning to face the two men. But Elara didn't run. She stood tall, her body trembling not with fear, but with a decade of unspent rage. The dam of her trauma had broken, and the words, so long trapped, came flooding out. He killed her, she said, her voice hoarse and cracking, but unmistakably hers. She pointed a shaking finger at her father. I saw you. You killed my mother. You let the horse trample her. And you told them I fell. Marcus stared at her, his eyes wide with genuine terror. The secret he had buried for 10 years was being spoken aloud. What is she talking about? Malachi asked, his gun wavering between Jed and the now speaking woman. She's lying. She's a crazy mute, Marcus shrieked. I am not mute, Elara said, taking a step toward him. Not anymore. You tried to bury me. You sold me. You thought I was your property. You have no power over me. As she spoke, Marcus, seeing his whole world unraveling, scrambled for the rifle Jed had dropped. He grabbed it and swung it up, aiming it at Jed. If I can't have the ranch, he screamed, no one will. He fired. Elara screamed Jed's name, but Jed was already moving, tackling Marcus to the ground. The shot went wide, echoing through the canyon. The two men wrestled for the gun. Malachi Finn, seeing his partner losing and his investment, Elara, now a liability, made a new calculation. He turned his pistol on Jed and Marcus, who were struggling on the ground. Let him have it, Stone, Finn yelled. But before he could fire, Elara acted. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet she'd been scouring by the porch. With a cry that came from the bottom of her soul, she swung it with all her strength, striking Malachi's gun hand. The pistol fired harmlessly into the sky as it flew from his grip. Malachi howled in pain, clutching his broken wrist. Jed used the distraction to gain control of the rifle. He slammed the butt of it into Marcus's temple, and her father went limp. It was over. Silence fell, broken only by Malachi's whimpering and Elara's ragged, gasping breaths. Jed kicked the pistol away from Malachi and stood, his chest heaving. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a stunned, profound awe. She was standing tall, the skillet still in her hand, tears streaming down her face, but her chin was high. He walked to her, slowly, as if she were a vision. Elara? He whispered. She looked at him, the man who had saved her, the man she had just saved. Jed, she said, and the sound of his name in her own voice was the sweetest sound she had ever heard. I can speak. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, burying his face in her hair. You spoke, he murmured. God, Elara, you spoke. I love you, she whispered, the words tumbling out, new and precious. I love you, Jedediah Stone. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his winter sky eyes finally completely clear of grief. I love you, Elara Vance. I've loved you since you tamed that broken horse. I've loved you since you saved my life in that blizzard. I just didn't know how to say it. They held each other as the sun began to set on the high meadow. Jed tied up Marcus and Malachi, and the next day he rode them back to Canyon Pass, handing them over to the U.S. Marshal along with Elara's clear, spoken testimony of her mother's murder. Her father, Marcus Vance, was tried and hanged, not for selling his daughter, but for the decade-old crime that had stolen her voice. Jed and Elara returned to the High Star Ranch. The silence that settled over them now was not one of trauma or loneliness. It was the shared, comfortable silence of a home. Elara spoke every day, her voice growing stronger, richer. She sang to the birds, she talked to the horses, and she whispered to Jed in the night. They were married by a traveling preacher the following spring. In their meadow, surrounded by the wild columbine, their love was a quiet, powerful thing, born in the harshest of winters, and strong as the mountains themselves. They had both been broken, haunted by ghosts of the past. But in that high, lonely sanctuary, they had found more than just redemption. They had found a voice, they had found a home, and they had found each other. What a journey. From a silent, broken girl sold as property, to a strong, courageous woman who found her voice and her home. Elara and Jed's story reminds us that even the deepest wounds can be healed by patience, respect, and a love that is brave enough to see the strength we hide from the world. Did you enjoy their story? If you did, please show your support and help our channel grow by hitting that like button, sharing this tale with your friends, and subscribing to Frontier Rescue Stories for more stories of survival and redemption. We have a whole playlist of stories just like this one, so be sure to check that out next. What did you think of Elara finding her voice at that final moment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have an idea for a future story you'd like to see, tell us. We love hearing from you. Thank you for being here, my dear friend. We hope you have a blessed day, and we can't wait to see you again for the next Frontier Rescue Story.